Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 21 in our course on General Psychology. And in this lecture, we're going to continue our unit on development. We'll, in fact, wrap that unit up in this lecture. Next time, we will start talking about personality, which is obviously highly related to development. In this lecture, we're going to talk about adolescence and adulthood. So last lecture, we talked about childhood, where a lot of development happens. But there's still quite a bit of change that occurs during those teenage years and even into old age, as we'll see. So by way of overview, we're looking at later phases of development, adolescence and adulthood. We'll talk about some of the physical changes that occur, and also we'll talk about sexual development. So that is in fact one of the defining characteristics of adolescence is puberty and sexual development, and that has an effect certainly on the body, but also on behavior. And that transition into adulthood is characterized by changes in and of itself. So adolescence is not simply sexual development. There are also changes happening in the brain that we're going to talk about. And even once you get into adulthood, that is not the end of development either. There are changes that occur as we age, some positive, some not so positive. But as we'll see, old age isn't as bad as it's sometimes made out to be. So what we're going to do here is learn about the adolescent brain. So how does it change? What is it that characterizes uh, the adolescent period in terms of brain development? We'll also look at sexuality. So how sexual development occurs, what are the influences on sexuality and sexual orientation. And as I mentioned, we'll see that adulthood does involve some negatives, some declines in terms certainly of physical abilities, but also of mental abilities. But it isn't all bad. And in fact, as we'll see, it's not as bad as it's often thought to be or made out to be. That old age has some positives as well. So we'll talk about that at the end of today's lecture. So I'll begin by talking about adolescence. In adolescence, we want to define the period first. It's bounded on the young end by the attainment of sexual maturity. And this generally happens anywhere from ages 11 to 14. It depends on sex, it depends on environment, and that age range is now younger than it used to be for sexual maturity. And this is largely a function of diet. There are also thought to be chemicals in the environment that we now have that mimic certain hormones and may begin sexual maturity earlier than it otherwise would be. Uh, but diet is a big factor here. People are getting better nutrition. And so puberty now has an earlier onset, again, around ages 11 to 14. And this marks the beginning of adolescence. It's bounded at the older end by adulthood. And this happens anywhere from ages 18 to 21. This is a little harder to define. There aren't obvious physical markers for adulthood like there are for sexual maturity. But generally, around ages 18 to 21 is the upper bound for adolescence. And adolescence, of course, is a period marked by physical changes. So there are the developments during puberty of what we call primary and secondary sexual characteristics. Primary sexual characteristics are those that deal directly with reproduction. So the onset of fertility in both males and females, the physical changes that occur with regard to the reproductive organs. So those are primary because, again, they deal with reproduction. The secondary sexual characteristics are physical changes that occur with puberty, but they don't deal directly with reproduction. So, for example, in females, the widening of the hips, the development of breasts, these are secondary sexual characteristics. For males, an increase in musculature, the development of facial hair. So these are secondary sexual characteristics as well. And in both sexes, the pitch of the voice changes. And all these things happen as a result of an increase in sex hormones. For males, testosterone. For females, estrogen. And as I mentioned before, estrogen is actually a group of hormones. It's not one hormone. I'm not going to belabor that distinction here. But we have this rise in hormone levels, and that brings about these physical changes. One thing that's occurred in recent years is what we call protracted adolescence. And what that is exactly what it sounds like. The adolescent period is protracted. It is longer than it used to be. And that is for two reasons. First, that sexual maturity, as I mentioned, is occurring earlier than it used to. So adolescence begins at an earlier period. And it also lasts longer because adulthood is attained later. It used to be the case that you often had adult responsibilities in the middle of the teenage years. Now it's more common to go to school for longer, to perhaps live with your parents for longer. And these are common trends. And again, they signal a later onset of adulthood. So you have sexual maturity earlier, you have adulthood later, and so that contributes to what we call protracted adolescence. In terms of the brain, one of the most critical parts of the brain that is still developing during adolescence is the prefrontal cortex. By the time one reaches adolescence, the brain is more or less full-sized, but the prefrontal cortex is still developing in terms of things like synaptic connections. Other areas of the brain are doing so as well, but the prefrontal cortex is most notable because of its influence on decision making and behavior. So newborns experience a lot of synapse proliferation, which is the development, the growth of new synapses. And this is followed by synaptic pruning, the death of many of those new synapses. So you gain a lot of new synapses, but then you lose them. And this is a natural process, this loss of synapses. And in general, you lose the synapses that aren't useful, the ones that allow neurons to communicate that don't need to talk to one another, or that aren't providing useful information to one another. And so this pruning is, again, a natural process. And the fact is that you don't want necessarily all of those synapses. So at first it was thought that really just happened during infancy. Now there's evidence that, at least in the prefrontal cortex, this occurs also during adolescence. That you'll have at the beginning of puberty synaptic proliferation, and as adolescence proceeds, you'll have synaptic pruning. And as we already mentioned in our unit on decision making, the prefrontal cortex is particularly important when it comes to things like assessing risk, avoiding risky behaviors, reining in impulses. And so, as the prefrontal cortex develops, individuals get better at those processes, those phenomena. Uh, that is to say, of course, that during adolescence, people are not always so great with regard to decision making because the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. So this bottom figure in the left here is from a study looking at how individuals in adolescence or young adulthood or full adulthood make decisions. Here they're playing what is effectively a video game, and the video game involves an element of risk. It's a driving video game, and so if you engage in risky behaviors during this game, you'll get involved in more crashes, as is true with driving in real life. And what's interesting is that adolescents are more heavily influenced by their peers. That if the peers are there, friends are present, that adolescents tend to engage in riskier behaviors. They have a harder time reining in impulses. And again, we think this is because the prefrontal cortex is not done developing. Okay, as I mentioned, uh, sexual development is an important part of adolescence, and part of sexual development is the onset of sexuality and sexual behavior. And a big part of that is one's sexual orientation. So whether one has a same-sex attraction or an opposite-sex attraction. And due to relatively recent research, we know that 1 to 2% of adolescents identify themselves as gay or lesbian. And again, we know from our unit on motivation that is a relatively recent body of knowledge. Uh, Previously, this was not something that was discussed. People are notoriously squeamish when it comes to discussing their sex lives or their sexual orientation. And so it was only in the last few decades that we've come to learn more about the prevalence of different sexual orientations. Now, I say 1 to 2%. Uh, that is, again, those that self identify. Uh, those that have reported a same sex relationship or a same sex attraction is, of course, higher. And again, we know this only relatively recently because of social norms. Most cultures have some period in their history where they uh, consider same-sex attraction or same-sex relationships to be taboo or to be immoral in some way. Um, this is changing in many cultures. So here in the right, we see a graph of the relative fraction of adults in the United States that either oppose or favor same-sex marriage. And we can see that these fractions of the population have crossed over a few years ago in regards to their prevalence. So, starting with the last few years, there are now more U.S. adults who favor same-sex marriage. And this is points out how new a phenomenon this is, how new this set of social norms is. And so that has a big impact on, first, our ability uh, to know what the prevalence of sexual orientation is, but also people's willingness to express that. We'll talk about sexual behavior here in a minute, and that doesn't necessarily line up with sexual orientation, and a lot of that has to do with social norms. In terms of what causes sexual orientation, we now know that there is a role of genetics, that it seems to be partially heritable. So if an individual has a particular orientation, it increases the likelihood that a sibling will share that orientation. It was previously thought that parental behavior had a big role in influencing sexual orientation. There's really no evidence for that. So a child's relationship with their mother or father doesn't really seem to impact what their eventual sexual orientation will be. But there does seem to be a role of genetics and perhaps a role of prenatal development. There's some evidence that sex hormones can influence eventual sexual orientation, and that there are physical markers in the brain that can suggest, not totally, but partially, what sexual orientation will be, at least in males. And of course, one thing that's common in adolescence is sexual behavior, regardless of orientation. And here we have a graph in the bottom left showing uh, the fraction of United States high school students that have engaged in sexual intercourse. And we see that the fraction is around 50%. It has gone down over the last couple of decades. And we think that is at least in part due to improvements in sexual education. Sexual education is a relatively new phenomenon. And it seems to be effective in delaying the onset of sexual behavior, but certainly in increasing the likelihood that an individual will use birth control. So abstinence-only sex education programs aren't very effective at that, turns out. So sex education does seem to have a positive impact on uh, the incidence of pregnancy, on the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases, and so it's an important component in adolescence to be educated about sexuality, about sexual behavior. And so we can see in recent years that sexual education is a important preventative when it comes to negative life outcomes. Okay, so adolescence is characterized as being that transition period from childhood to adulthood. And there have been theories put forth about what's happening psychologically as a child develops. And we'll talk about one here, and that is the theory of Erik Erikson and what he called psychosocial development. So we see Erikson here on the right. Uh, Erikson was an influential psychologist and personality theorist. Uh, whether all the components of his theory are based in evidence is up for debate. But as we'll see, some of the ideas they talked about may be familiar. So Erikson described the process of development as a series of crises. And this is not to imply that every waking moment of someone's life is stressful. What a crisis was for Erikson was a kind of decision that had to be made. And in early childhood, it was things like, who can I trust, if anyone? So I can trust my caregiver or not. I can try to exert my will. If I try to exert my will, if I try to do things for myself, will I be rewarded or will I be punished? And Erikson's ideal was that the outcomes of these attempts and the outcomes of these decisions had a big impact on later personality. Now, in adolescence, one of the biggest crises is the establishment of identity. The individual has to ask, who am I? And try to answer that question, try to establish an identity. If you've ever heard of the term identity crisis, this is where that comes from. So Erikson is the one who put forth the idea of the identity crisis. Someone in adolescence is trying to figure out who they are, and if that attempt is thwarted in some way, if they're unable to establish an identity, they may turn to negative personality traits or negative behaviors like crime in order to establish some kind of identity, even if it's one that perhaps is not all that benevolent or helpful. And so the establishment of identity is an important part of adolescence. And Erikson pointed out that as an individual establishes an identity, they make choices. And of course, a person doesn't choose their parents, but they do choose their peers. And so who that individual, as they develop, chooses to associate with uh, constitutes a series of choices and is thought to be a means of establishing an identity by associating with different peer groups. Of course, one eventually transitions into adulthood, and Erikson had ideas there as well. Your book doesn't go into this as much, but Erikson's psychosocial development theory covers the whole lifespan. It's not just about childhood or adolescence. So, as one grows into adulthood, one tends to develop relationships, intimate relationships. And so here, the idea is that one has established an identity during adolescence, and now can the person share that identity? Will they lose themselves if they engage in intimate relationship? Uh, and so this is another stage in development, the ability to associate with another person intimately while still maintaining one's identity. Of course, as one goes further into adulthood, one often becomes a parent, or even if one doesn't become a parent, one becomes involved in the lives of younger individuals. And so whether people engage in that sort of fostering relationship, whether they will try to nurture younger generations, is an important part of development in Erikson's theory. And then finally, as one approaches old age, and therefore, of course, inevitably death, uh, one tends to look back on their life. And everyone has successes and failures. And one of the last stages in Erikson's model is whether someone can accept those successes and failures, whether they can incorporate that into their personality successfully. And then finally, as one approaches advanced old age, of course, one starts to deteriorate physically and mentally, and we'll get into that here in a minute. Uh, and one starts to see those old crises crop up again, things that were sort of conquered in childhood. So the ability to exert one's will, to make decisions, to depend on other people to take care of them. Uh, these occur during early childhood, but they often occur during old age as well as we lose those physical and mental abilities. So that is a fuller version of Erikson's model, of the series of crises and decisions that one has to make before one can advance to the next stage. So moving on to adulthood, we do know that as one progresses through adulthood, abilities change. So certainly physical abilities change. You start to suffer physical degeneration starting in your 30s. And so you'll lose muscle mass. Your senses become less acute. Uh, and things like your book points out, things like skin elasticity start to change as well. Uh, Obviously, you undergo a reproductive decline as well. As you reach middle age, fertility rates decrease, uh, and sexual function decreases. More importantly for our course here, you have cognitive changes as well. So you start to lose aspects of memory, in particular, working memory, that ability to hold information in mind. You start to lose certain kinds of long-term memory. So you tend to lose episodic memory, that is your memory for events in your life. You tend to retain semantic memory, that is your knowledge of definitions, facts, often the kind of things you learn in school. Uh, you don't really lose your vocabulary. In fact, your vocabulary, your skills when it comes to language, tend to increase through middle age. But most other cognitive abilities do tend to peak somewhere around the 20s. However, this does not mean that overall performance cognitively decreases with old age. The fact is that, sure, you lose some of your cognitive abilities, but you're gaining a lot of experience over the years. And so for many, if not most tasks, at least mental tasks, performance in older adults is comparable to that in younger adults because older adults can compensate for a deficit in cognitive abilities by practice and experience. This, of course, eventually changes as you get into things like the 80s and 90s, where those cognitive deficits can start to take a real toll on performance. But for example, at the bottom of this slide, we have this figure looking at what was effectively a trivia task. People were asked to answer trivia questions. And younger adults and older adults do pretty much the same when it comes to learning from their mistakes, if those mistakes are surprising. If they were really confident about their answer and it turns out they were wrong, they tend to learn the correct answer pretty quickly and pretty equally between younger and older adults. However, for those mistakes where the participant knew that they were not as confident, the older adults tend to learn better than the younger ones do. It takes the younger ones longer to learn from those unsurprising mistakes, if they're called. Of course, there are changes in the brain as well. So, again, we'll talk about the prefrontal cortex. It finishes developing in early adulthood, and we do start to see declines in older adulthood in the prefrontal cortex. But more importantly, we again see a compensation effect. So in young adults, you have a lot of bilateral asymmetry. What does that mean? Well, it means that certain abilities, certain kinds of information rely on parts of the brain, but on one side of the brain in particular. As you get older, those distinct boundaries tend to get fuzzier. So the brain will use nearby areas, or will use the same area on both sides of the brain. And you'll see activity in both sides in older adults. You don't see that in younger adults. And we think that is how older adults are compensating for an overall decline in cognitive ability, but they're compensating for it through experience and through using other parts of the brain. So here is an image from a neuroimaging study looking at neural activity. And we see in young adults activity, those yellow blobs, just on one side of the brain, in this case on the right side of this image. However, if you compare that to older adults, you see activity in the same general region, but it occurs on both sides. So that is our evidence for this reduction in bilateral asymmetry as adults age. So a little more on adulthood. Uh, at a more psychological level, there's what's called socio-emotional selectivity theory, which is granted a lot of syllables. But what it really means is that as you age, you tend to emphasize different things in your experience. So younger adults tend to put more emphasis on learning because the argument is that younger adults have more of their lives ahead of them, and information gathering is the most important thing because you have your whole life to apply that information. It may help you numerous times before the end of your life. And so the emphasis here is not on necessarily positive experiences. Negative experiences can be useful too. The important thing is to learn new things. However, for older adults, they tend to make decisions and emphasize memories based on satisfaction with the present time. So they're not trying to learn a lot of new information. Why? Well, they don't have as much time left, and so information that could be useful for the future isn't as useful. Your future is shorter. And so this picture here on the right just goes to show that as you age, uh, this is a memory task, and older adults recalled fewer negative images. There's an emphasis on positive images. Now, when you're young, again, positive and negative experiences can be beneficial. When you're older, you tend to emphasize those positive experiences. And that shows up when you ask older adults which kinds of stimuli they remember in a memory task. Now, when you look at life satisfaction, what's interesting is that life actually seems to get better for older adults. They tend to report more satisfaction with their lives, more satisfaction with their appearance. They report less stress. They worry about fewer things. They're angry less often. So overall quality of life seems to actually improve. And this is counter to our understanding of old age. Uh, no one looks forward to old age. Everyone thinks of it as a time when you start to lose your mental faculties, when you start to lose your physical abilities, when you start to lose friends and social contact, you start to lose your independence. And these things are, to a certain degree, true, but not nearly to the degree that we expect. So in the lower right here, we have a table from your book showing what people expect here on the left in terms of losses as they age. So everyone expects to lose their memory, uh, lose independence, lose friends, lose a feeling of importance. And they anticipate that lots of people, the majority in some cases, will experience these negative consequences. If you actually ask older adults, far fewer actually report these negative experiences. So when you're young, you overestimate all the bad things that are going to happen when you get old. When in fact, as you get old, sure, some problems arise, but not with the frequency you expect. And again, emotionally, your life satisfaction tends to be actually higher than it was when you were younger. So getting old isn't as bad as it seems. Of course, one big life event that's common is marriage. Another is parenthood. And we've already talked a little bit about this in our unit on consciousness, where people talk about taking care of children as being a very satisfying part of their lives. Uh, that's again, if you just give them a questionnaire. If you actually query them while they're taking care of their children, they report that that process is not really much more satisfying than housework. And we see a related trend here that people report lower satisfaction with their lives, especially if they have young children or adolescents. That their satisfaction with being married is highest before children and also after the children have left the home. So taking care of children may not produce that affective boost as much as we think. That being said, in general, people who are married tend to report higher happiness. Uh, that being said, as your book points out, it's hard to say whether marriage causes happiness or whether happy people are more likely to get married. And so we have a correlation here but it's very difficult to say what the cause is and what the effect is. Does marriage cause happiness, or does happiness cause marriage? It's not quite clear. What's also interesting is not only that we have these trends over time, where, again, satisfaction with life tends to decrease once children are in the picture, and then increase again once they're gone. You also have sort of a secondary effect. That decrease in happiness with young children is influenced by culture. So certain countries report that having young children around is more of a burden in terms of impact on happiness. Other countries don't report that. They do actually can report that children improve their lives. And it's not clear what about these cultures makes that difference. But time is a factor, but so is culture when it comes to happiness with children and with marriage. Okay, that will do it for our unit on development. Next time, we're going to start learning about personality, what makes us who we are, what makes people different from one another. So we'll talk about how we measure personality. It's a very qualitative phenomenon, it seems. So how do we measure it? We'll also talk about different theories of personality. What do we think the structure of personality is? And there have been different ideas here as well. And then we'll finally talk about determinants. So how does a person end up with the personality they have? Is it genetic? Is it environmental? How much of it happens as a young child? How much of it happens toward adulthood? So we'll talk about that as well, and I will see you then.